At 12, pregnant and abandoned, she met a lone mountain man. His actions would change her life. I was 12 years old when they cast me out, banished from the only home I had ever known because of the life growing beneath my tattered dress. In the eyes of the Pine Ridge elders, my child was not a blessing, but a mark of corruption made flesh, and I was the bearer of that unforgivable disgrace. The judgment was delivered not in a courtroom, but in the center of the muddy main street before the very people who had watched me grow. Their faces were a collection of stone masks carved with righteous judgment and cold, satisfied morality. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. My own father stood among them, his gaze harder than granite, his silence the heaviest blow of all. He was a man of the cloth, a foundation of the community, and my existence had become a crack in his reputation. He did not defend me. He did not plead for clemency. He simply nodded, sealing my fate with a dip of his weathered head. They gave me a small canvas sack with a chunk of stale cornbread, a jug of water, and the clothes on my back. It was a gesture not of charity, but of finality, a washing of their hands of me and the shame I carried. The last words my father spoke to me were not of love or regret, but of bitter condemnation, words that would echo through my steps into the wilderness. "You have your mother's corruption in you," he hissed, his voice low so only I could hear. "A sickness in the soul. Now go, and may the Lord have mercy on your damned spirit, for this town will not." I didn't grasp the full weight of his words then, the hidden history they hinted at. I only understood the venom, the complete rejection in his eyes. He turned his back, and the great wooden gates of Pine Ridge groaned shut behind me, the sound of final definitive period on the brief sentence of my childhood. The Colorado sun was a relentless anvil, hammering down on the harsh, unforgiving land that was now my prison. Every boulder, every scrub pine seemed to mock my despair. Solitude was a physical presence, a crushing weight that stole my breath with each step I took away from Pine Ridge. The whispers of my past grew louder. The faces of my accusers burned into my memory. I was no longer Emma Rose, daughter of a preacher. I was an outcast, a ghost in waiting, a warning tale whispered to wayward daughters. Days melted into one another, a haze of scorching heat and freezing nights. The cornbread was long gone, the water a precious, fading memory. My body ached, not just from the strain of my pregnancy, but from the deep, hollowing ache of complete abandonment. I stumbled through the brush, my bare feet cracked and bleeding, my vision blurring. I was dying. I collapsed under the meager shade of a scrub oak, the fight finally draining from me. This was it. This was the end my father, my town, had chosen for me. As darkness began to creep at the edges of my sight, I saw not the angels I had been taught about, but the stark, brutal beauty of the land that was to be my grave. Yet as my eyes fluttered closed, a shadow fell over me, long and silent, blocking the cruel sun. It was not the shadow of a cloud, nor of a buzzard circling overhead. It was the shadow of a man, still and watchful, his presence an unexpected and terrifying intrusion into my final moments. A deep, primal fear, colder than any mountain night, pierced through my exhaustion. I was no longer alone, but I had no idea if I had been saved or if my suffering was only just beginning. Her journey into the unknown is about to begin. If you need to find out what fate awaits her and believe that hope can be found in the darkest of places, then make sure to join us. Leave a like on this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single moment of this story. The man's face was a map of the very land that had tried to kill me, carved by wind and snow. His features were weathered, his eyes holding the ancient, patient wisdom of the peaks themselves. He was a mountain man. Everything I had ever been taught about his kind screamed danger, a primal warning that coiled in my gut. He watched me for a long time as I drifted back to consciousness, his expression unreadable, his stillness that of a predator sizing up its prey. I expected a blade at my throat, a swift and brutal end. Instead, he extended a worn leather water skin. It was not an offering of friendship. It was a simple, factual statement. Water. I scrambled for it, my hands trembling, and drank with a desperation that was humiliating. The cool liquid, a shocking miracle against my parched throat. For a moment there was nothing else in the world but the water, the taste of life itself. When it was done, he took the water skin back and, without a word, turned to walk away. His back was a rigid wall of indifference. He was leaving me. The brief, desperate flare of hope that had ignited within me was extinguished, leaving behind an icy dread. This was it. He had given me a final drink, a last rite before abandoning me to the inevitable. But then, something broke inside of me. It was not the fragile hope, but the heavy cloak of victimhood. A different kind of strength, born of pure, undiluted rage at the injustice of it all, surged through my exhausted limbs. I would not die like this, not as a footnote in someone else's journey. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, the effort making my head spin. "Wait!" I called out, my voice a ragged croak. He did not stop. "Wait!" I shouted louder this time, the sound tearing from my throat. He paused, his back still to me, a silent question hanging in the shimmering air between us. I had his attention. I had to choose my next words, as if my life and the life inside me depended on them, because they did. I would not beg. I had been brought low by the pity and judgment of my own people. I would not grovel before a stranger. "You walk away from one life," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "But you are leaving two to the vultures. Does the mountain you call home not care for new life? Or is your heart as barren as this ground?" The silence that followed was absolute. He stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, a statue silhouetted against the blinding sun. I saw his shoulders tense. I had struck something, a nerve hidden deep beneath the stoic exterior. Slowly he turned. His eyes were not angry, but they were not kind either. They were unsettlingly perceptive, as if they could see right through my skin and bone to the secret I carried, to the shame my father had branded me with, to the flicker of defiance that now kept me from collapsing. He walked back and stood over me, his shadow once again falling upon me. This time it felt less like a threat and more like a judgment. He studied my swollen belly, then my face, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pity, but a deep ancient sorrow, a weariness that seemed to echo my own. He had known loss. This I knew with a certainty that defied logic. He was an outcast, same as me. "The mountains do not care for the weak," he said, his voice low and gravelly, the first words he had spoken. "They claim them. That is their way." "I am not weak," I countered, the words tasting like a prayer and a lie all at once. "I am surviving." He let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh in another life. "You were dying when I found you." He crouched down, bringing his face level with mine. The intensity of his gaze was a physical force. "I will not be your savior. I have no charity for your world or its people. But the spirits of this land do not favor a needless end. So I will make you a promise, little ghost. Not a bargain, a promise. You will follow me. You will learn to be silent. You will learn to listen to the wind and read the stone. You will work until your arms ache and your legs tremble. You will forget your God, your father, and the town that threw you away. You will become a creature of this place, or this place will devour you. If you cry, if you complain, if you slow my path, I will leave you where you stand. That is the only mercy I can offer." It was the cruelest, most terrifying offer I had ever received. And it was also the most beautiful. It was a chance. It was a path forward that was not a path to a grave. He was not offering a hand to hold, but a cliff to climb, and he would be watching to see if I would fall. I looked from his hardened face to the endless, hostile expanse around me. My choice was simple: a certain death alone or a possible life with this dangerous, solitary man. Using every last ounce of my will, I pushed myself from the ground. My legs shook violently. My body screamed in protest, but I got to my feet. I stood before him, unsteady but upright. A girl of 12, pregnant and abandoned, covered in the dust of her own near grave. I met his gaze and gave him the only answer I had left, a single determined nod. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and began to walk, not looking back to see if I was following. He knew I would. And so my new life began with a silent promise and a single step, following a stranger into the heart of the wilderness that was meant to be my end. The journey to his world was a silent, grueling pilgrimage. Jeremiah moved with a fluid, grounded stride that seemed to ignore the punishing terrain while I stumbled behind him, my breath like fire in my lungs, my legs trembling with the effort to keep pace. His promise echoed with every agonizing step. "If you slow my path, I will leave you where you stand." The fear of being abandoned again was a more potent fuel than food or water. It pushed me onward past the point of exhaustion until my world narrowed to the sight of his back and the burning need to take just one more step. After what felt like days but was likely only hours, he led me through a narrow gap between two towering rock faces, a passage so well hidden I would have walked past it 1,000 times. We emerged into a small secluded valley, a secret world of stone and shade. A thin trickle of water cascaded down a rock wall into a clear pool, the sound a balm to my frayed nerves. His home was not a cabin or a shack, but a shallow cave carved into the valley wall, its mouth veiled by a curtain of ancient vines. Inside it was Spartan, a testament to a life stripped to its barest essentials. There were sleeping furs, a blackened fire pit in the center, a few clay pots and tools that were elegantly simple and brutally effective. This was not a home. It was a den, a place of function and refuge, devoid of comfort or sentiment. It was a reflection of the man himself. In the days that followed, I became a student of his silence. I watched him constantly, my initial fear slowly giving way to a weary, grudging respect. He was a master of his domain. His movements were economical, each one imbued with purpose. He could read the subtlest signs in the landscape, a displaced pebble, a bent blade of grass, the distant call of a hawk, and understand their meaning. He taught me, but not with words. His lessons were harsh, practical, and delivered through action. He would simply hand me a task, and I was expected to learn by doing. The first was water. He led me to the base of the valley wall, pointed to a patch of damp earth and a specific type of broad-leafed plant, and handed me a flat, sharp stone. Then he walked away. I dug for hours, my hands quickly becoming raw and blistered until I finally unearthed a thick, pale root. I brought it to him, a silent offering of my labor. He took it, sliced a piece off with his knife, and chewed it, his expression unchanging. He then handed a piece to me. It was bitter, but it was wet, a slow trickle of moisture that eased my thirst. He had not taught me how to find water. He had forced me to discover it. Another day, he worked on a bow, meticulously shaping the wood, his focus absolute. I sat nearby, tasked with grinding corn on a large flat rock. The work was tedious, my back screaming in protest. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our valley, I watched him from the corner of my eye. He finished his work on the bow and paused, his gaze fixed on the flames of the fire we had built. For a fleeting moment, the hard mask of the warrior slipped. A profound loneliness, a deep and aching grief clouded his features. It was as if he were looking into a past that was far removed from this harsh existence. Then he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a single dried wildflower. Its petals faded, but still intact. He held it in his calloused palm, his thumb stroking it with a tenderness that seemed utterly alien to him. It was a gesture so private, so filled with unspoken story, that I felt as if I had trespassed on sacred ground. In that moment, he was not the stoic mountain man stranger. He was a man mourning a ghost. He put the flower away as quickly as he had taken it out, his expression once again becoming an unreadable shield. But I had seen it. I had seen the crack in the stone. It did not make him less frightening, but it made him more human. Lying on my rough fur that night, every muscle in my body throbbing, I felt a confusing mix of emotions. I was still a prisoner of my circumstances, bound to this harsh man by a promise of survival. I resented his coldness, his relentless demands. I missed the simple softness of a mattress, the taste of a cooked meal I hadn't had to bleed for. But as I listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing across the fire, a new feeling began to take root in the barren soil of my heart. It was a hard-won sense of accomplishment. I had survived another day. I had learned. In Pine Ridge, I was a source of shame, my worth determined by the judgment of others. Here in this brutal, honest world, my worth was measured only by my will to live. And for the first time in a very long time, I began to believe I was not as weak as my father had told me I was. The heat of the sun intensified over the following weeks, baking the valley until the very stones seemed to sigh in the oppressive air. The trickle of water that was our lifeline slowed to a reluctant drip, and the game that had been plentiful seemed to vanish into the shimmering heat waves. Jeremiah grew leaner, his face more drawn as he pushed himself further and further each day, hunting for what little the scorched earth would offer. He never complained, but I saw the toll it was taking. The unspoken tension in our small sanctuary grew with each meager meal. The test came not with a roar but with a stumble. He returned one evening just as twilight bled across the sky, his leg wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. A bear, cornered and furious, had charged him. The gash was deep, and by the next morning a fever had taken hold. He lay on his furs, his body radiating a heat that had nothing to do with the sun, his breathing shallow. He was lost to a world of delirium. His strength, which I had believed to be as indomitable as the mountains, now gone. For the first time I was truly alone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. He was the pillar holding up my world, and he was crumbling. My first instinct was to despair, to curl up and wait for the end that had been hunting me since I left Pine Ridge. But then I looked at him, at the man who had shown me not kindness, but a brutal path to survival. He had not let me die. I would not let him. His lessons delivered in silence and action rose from my memory. I saw him pointing out a dull green plant with broad, waxy leaves. "This one draws the poison." His voice echoed in my mind, though he had never actually spoken the words, only shown me by crushing a leaf and applying it to a scorpion's sting on his own hand. I searched the valley, my heart pounding with a desperate urgency. The sun beat down, but I barely felt it. I was a hunter now, but my prey was a plant. Finally, I found it, growing in the cool shadow of a boulder near the almost dry waterfall. I crushed the leaves between two stones just as I had seen him do, creating a dark, pungent paste. With trembling hands, I unwrapped the crude bandage from his leg. The wound was angry, red, and swollen. Swallowing my fear, I gently cleaned it with precious water from our dwindling supply and applied the paste. He flinched in his fevered sleep, but did not wake. That was only the first battle. The second was hunger. The corn was nearly gone. His bow and arrows leaned against the cave wall, useless in my untrained hands, but I remembered the rabbits. I remembered the almost invisible trails he had shown me, the way he would stop and point to a patch of disturbed dirt, a sign of their passage. I remembered his hands deftly weaving hemp fibers into a cord, creating a snare that was both simple and ingenious. My first attempts were clumsy. The fibers pricked my fingers. The knots were loose. I wanted to weep with frustration. The image of my father's condemning face flashed in my mind. Corruption in your blood. No, I would not be weak. I took a deep breath, mimicking the calm focus I had so often observed in Jeremiah. I started again, my fingers slowly learning the rhythm, the feel of the fibers. I made 3 snares. They were not as perfect as his, but they were strong. I took them to the trails he had shown me and set them, my hands moving with a newfound certainty. The rest of the day was a vigil of fear and hope. I changed his paste, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. I waited. The next morning, as the first rays of sun touched the valley rim, I went to check the snares. The first was empty. The second was empty. My heart sank. But the third held a small rabbit. A wave of triumph so powerful it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. It was not a gift. It was not luck. I had earned this. I had listened. I had learned. I had provided. I prepared the animal with a knife he had left near the fire pit, my actions hesitant but deliberate. By the time the sun was high, Jeremiah's fever had begun to break. He woke to the smell of roasting meat. He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time in 2 days. He saw the new paste on his leg. Then his gaze drifted to the small rabbit cooking over the fire. He said nothing. No words of thanks, no praise. But his silence was different. The silence of judgment was gone. The silence of indifference was gone. This was a silence of acknowledgement. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his movements slow and pained. I took a piece of the cooked meat and handed it to him. He took it and ate, his eyes never leaving mine. In that shared meal, in that profound quiet, everything changed. I was no longer the burden. I was no longer the lost girl he had pitied. I had proven my worth not to him but to myself, and in doing so had earned something far more valuable than his protection. I had earned his respect. The respect I had earned was a fragile thing, an unspoken truce in our silent world. But the wilderness is never content with peace. The true test of our bond came not from within, but from the outside world we had both sought to escape. They were trappers, 2 of them, with sun-bleached beards and eyes that held a greedy, restless hunger. They stumbled into our valley by chance, drawn by the same life-giving water that sustained us. They saw our secluded camp, but more than that, they saw me. They saw a young white girl, and then they looked at Jeremiah, who was still favoring his injured leg, and a vile, knowing smirk spread across their faces. In their eyes I was a captive, and they were my self-proclaimed rescuers, a role they intended to play for their own cruel amusement. "Well, now look what we have here," the taller one said, his voice slick with false concern. "Looks like this poor little thing needs some help." They advanced slowly, splitting up to flank us. My blood ran cold. These were not men of God like my father. They were men of opportunity, and they saw a golden one. Jeremiah rose slowly, placing his body squarely between me and them. He held his knife, its blade dull in the shade of the valley, but his stance was a clear warning. He was weakened, and they knew it. "Easy there, mountain man," the second man grunted, circling around. "We just want the girl. No need for anyone to get hurt." As the first man lunged toward him, I saw the entire confrontation play out in my mind. Jeremiah, still not at his full strength, would be overwhelmed. They would take me, and the fate they had planned would be 1,000 times worse than dying alone in the dust. But I was not the same girl who had been cast out of Pine Ridge. Fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now woven with strands of something else: the resilience of the desert, the focus of a hunter, the fierce protective instinct of a mother. While Jeremiah parried the first man's clumsy attack, the second one closed in on his weakened side. There was no time to think, only to act. I remembered Jeremiah's first lesson: the two plants side by side. One gave water, the other pain. Just inches from my hand, growing in a crevice, was the plant with the leaves that burned the skin. I didn't hesitate. I ripped a handful from the bush, the caustic oils immediately stinging my own palm, and threw them with all my might into the second man's face. He let out a piercing shriek, dropping his weapon to claw at his eyes. A stream of curses filling the valley. The distraction was all Jeremiah needed. With a speed that defied his injury, he dispatched the first man. A swift and terrible conclusion to the threat. The second, blinded and screaming, scrambled away, crashing through the brush and vanishing from our sanctuary. The sudden, violent silence that descended was deafening. It was broken only by Jeremiah's heavy breathing and the distant fading cries of the man I had blinded. Jeremiah leaned against the valley wall, the knife still in his hand, his chest rising and falling. The immediate danger was over, but the wall of silence between us had been shattered by the violence, and there was no rebuilding it. After a long moment, I found my voice. "Did you have a family?" The question was quiet, almost a whisper, but it landed in the stillness with the force of a thrown stone. He was silent for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. He slid down the rock wall to sit on the ground, the fight having drained his remaining strength. "Yes," he finally said, his voice raspy, his gaze fixed on a place beyond the valley walls. "A wife, a daughter. They were taken by the fever, the burning sickness that swept through the settlements. I sat with them until their spirits left." He paused, and the grief I had once glimpsed in his eyes now filled them completely. When they were gone, my own spirit went with them. I could no longer be among my people, among the memories. I became what I am now, a man who walks alone. And the simple, devastating story hung in the air, a truth so painful it seemed to make the air shimmer. He had lost everything. He then looked at me, at my swollen belly, and his eyes held not judgment, but a shared understanding of loss. "The one who planted that seed," he asked, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "Does he carry the burden with you?" Tears I didn't know I had left to cry welled in my eyes. "He was just a boy," I whispered, as scared as I was. "His family learned of it, and sent him back east on a wagon before my own father even knew. I never saw him again. I was the only one left to be punished." In the quiet that followed, we were no longer a mountain man and white girl, outcast in exile. We were just two people stripped bare by sorrow, our tragedies laid out between us. I saw that his leg was bleeding again. The wound reopened in the struggle. Without a word, I went to our small store of supplies, brought the paste and a clean rag, and knelt before him. As I gently cleaned and redressed the wound, my touch was not just that of a student repaying a debt. It was the touch of someone who cared. He watched me, his guard completely down for the first time, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude. When I finished, he reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear. It was a simple, profound gesture of tenderness. We were no longer bound by a promise of survival. In the crucible of shared danger and shared sorrow, a new bond had been forged, We were a clan of two, and we would face the coming storm together. In the wake of the violence, a profound quiet settled in the valley, but it was a quiet of a different kind. The silence of strangers had been replaced by the comfortable peace of companions. The unspoken rules of survival that had governed our existence softened and reshaped themselves into the gentle rhythms of a shared life. A new language grew between us, one spoken in anticipating a need, in a shared glance, in the simple, unspoken understanding of two people who had seen the darkest parts of each other and had not turned away. His instructions were no longer stark commands. He would show me a plant and explain how its roots held the morning dew. He would point to the sky and speak of the coming snow, not as a threat but as a promise. He was still a man of few words, but the words he chose were now offerings, pieces of his knowledge gifted to me, not forced upon me. As my body grew heavier with the child, my movements became slower, more deliberate. I watched as he quietly took on the tasks that had become difficult for me, collecting firewood from further down the valley, carrying the water skins without my having to ask. His care was a silent, steady presence, a shield against the harshness of the world. These were the days of small tendernesses. I would find a uniquely colored stone or a fallen eagle feather placed near my sleeping fur, small treasures from his journeys beyond our valley walls. In return, I took to mending his worn clothes, my stitches clumsy at first, but earnest, patching a tear in his sleeve with a strip of cloth from the hem of my own dress. One evening, as the fire danced between us, he began to carve a piece of soft pine wood. For days he worked on it in the quiet moments, his knife moving with a patient, loving precision. When he was finished, he held it out to me. It was a small, smooth figurine of a mountain goat, its head tilted as if listening to a secret. It was a toy for my child. I took it, my fingers tracing the elegant lines, and tears filled my eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of a deep, overwhelming gratitude that left me breathless. This stoic, grieving warrior was making a space in his broken heart for a child that was not his. The toy mountain goat seemed to unlock a door between us, and through it, stories began to flow. He told me of his own boyhood, of learning to track, not to kill, but to understand the patterns of the world. He shared a legend of his people, a story of how the moon was a shy maiden, hiding her face from the sun's fierce glare. In the safety of his presence, I finally found the courage to speak to my unborn child, not in whispers of fear, but in words of hope. I would rest my hands on my belly and tell the baby about the valley, about the hawk that circled overhead, about the quiet, strong man who kept us safe. One night I told Jeremiah, "I hope the baby has your eyes so they can see the truth in things." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was a fleeting, beautiful thing. The love that grew between us was not a sudden fire, but a slow creeping vine wrapping itself around the broken pillars of our lives and drawing us together. It bloomed one night when a nightmare took me, a shadowy echo of my father's condemnation and the leering faces of the trappers. I woke with a stifled cry, my heart hammering against my ribs. Instantly he was awake, his silhouette dark against the dying embers of the fire. He did not speak, but his eyes asked the question. I had no words to explain the terror. I only knew that the loneliness was a cold physical ache, a chasm that threatened to swallow me whole. I shifted, moving closer to the warmth of the fire, and he understood. He reached across the small space between our sleeping furs and gently pulled a heavy bear hide over me. His hand rested on my shoulder, a solid, reassuring weight in the darkness. The simple touch was an anchor. It was safety. It was home. I turned to face him, and in the soft red glow of the coals our eyes met. The years of pain, of exile, of grief, all fell away. There was only this moment, this profound, sacred connection. He leaned in slowly, giving me every chance to turn away. But I did not. I met him halfway. His kiss was not one of passion or of desperate need. It was as gentle as the fall of evening light, a soft, reverent touch that spoke of shared sorrows and a future he never expected to have. It was a promise of protection, a vow of tenderness, an acceptance of this strange, beautiful thing we had built together in the heart of the wilderness. In that moment, we were no longer two separate, broken souls. We were one. We had built a fragile shelter of hope. And for the first time, the future felt not like a threat, but like a sunrise we would get to see together. Our small paradise was a bubble of tranquility, a world spun from mutual trust in the quiet blossoming of love. We measured time by the shifting angle of the sun and the steady growth of the child within me. But the past is a patient hunter, and it had not forgotten us. The first sign of its approach was a subtle shift in Jeremiah. He grew still, his head cocked, listening to something I could not hear. The comfortable peace in his eyes was replaced by the sharp, cold alertness of a warrior. He had been a man at peace. Now he was a sentinel on a wall I couldn't see. "They are coming," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not need to say who. There was only one posse that would hunt me with such purpose. The trapper I had blinded must have found his way back to civilization, back to Pine Ridge, his tongue weaving a tale of a savage captor and a stolen white girl. And my father, a man whose pride was as brittle as mountain shale, would have seized upon the story. A holy crusade to save his fallen daughter and restore his tarnished name. The choice before us was a precipice. Jeremiah's instinct was to run, to melt into the harsh wilderness that was his true home. But I was no longer the girl who could keep pace with him. I was heavy, clumsy, my body preparing for the imminent arrival of our child. To flee would be to expose us, to risk everything on a desperate flight. To stay felt like madness, a lamb waiting for the wolves. "I can lead them away," Jeremiah said, his eyes scanning the valley entrance. "Give you time." I looked at him, at the man who had pieced my world back together, and I knew he was offering to sacrifice himself. He would be one man against a posse, a ghost against their guns. The thought of being alone again was more terrifying than any confrontation. "No," I said, my voice shaking but firm. I placed my hand on my belly. "We are a family. We do not leave each other behind. This is our home. We will stand here together." A flicker of surprise, then a deep, resonant pride shone in his eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. We were united. We would face the storm. We did not have to wait long. A voice achingly familiar and yet utterly alien in our sanctuary echoed off the valley walls. "Emma Rose, we have come to deliver you." It was my father. His voice was filled with a booming, self-righteous certainty, the voice of a man convinced of his own godliness. He was not here to save me. He was here to reclaim a piece of property, to erase a stain. The sound of it reopened a wound I thought had begun to heal, pouring the salt of my old shame and humiliation back into it. For Jeremiah, the shouts of armed white men intruding upon his land were a visceral echo of the sickness, of the loss, of the relentless encroachment that had destroyed his world. His hand rested on the handle of his knife, his knuckles white. When my father appeared at the narrow entrance to our valley, flanked by half a dozen men with rifles at the ready, he saw a sight that shattered his narrative. He did not see a frightened captive girl. He saw his daughter standing tall, her pregnant form a testament to a life he had condemned, and beside me, his hand resting protectively on my shoulder, was the man he had labeled a savage. We were not captor and victim. We were a fortress. "Father," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying across the space between us, "you have no right to be here. You cast me out. You left me to die. This is my home now." My father's face, a mask of righteous fury, twisted in disbelief and rage. He saw my defiance, my lack of shame, and the quiet, unshakable bond between me and Jeremiah. It was more than he could bear. "You speak with a serpent's tongue taught to you by this heathen," he roared, raising his rifle, its dark metal glinting in the sun. "I will not see my blood defiled. I will cleanse this sin myself." His men followed his lead, the clicks of their cocking rifles like a death rattle in the quiet valley. The air grew thick, the moment stretched thin, poised to snap. Jeremiah pushed me slightly behind him, ready to absorb the first bullet. My father's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that instant of unbearable tension as the world held its breath, a different kind of violence erupted. A white, hot, sharp, and undeniable pain tore through my body. I gasped, crying out as my knees buckled, my hands flying to the taut drum of my belly. The world narrowed to that single searing reality: the baby. My baby was coming now. The first cry of my labor was a sound that broke the world. It shattered the tense standoff, replacing the specter of violence with the raw, undeniable reality of life, demanding to be born. The men in my father's posse flinched, their righteous certainty faltering. Their rifles, which had been aimed with such conviction, now seemed heavy and purposeless. This was not the battle they had come to fight. In that moment of hesitation, Jeremiah became a force of nature. His focus shifted entirely from the men outside to me. With a strength that belied the urgency of the moment, he swept me into his arms and carried me back into the deeper shadows of our cave. He laid me gently on the softest furs, his movements swift and sure. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a guardian, a midwife, a priest of the oldest rite of all. His voice was a low, calming murmur, a steady anchor in my sea of pain. He spoke in his own tongue, the words unfamiliar, but the tone a universal language of comfort and strength. Outside, my father's voice rose in a furious, desperate shriek. "It is a deception, a devil's ploy to weaken your resolve. Do not listen. Fire upon the cave. Cleanse this place." But his men did not obey. One of them, a weather-beaten man with weary eyes, lowered his rifle completely. "Reverend," he said, his voice strained, "we can't. Not while that ain't right. She is birthing the spawn of sin," my father roared, his face a grotesque mask of fury. "To hesitate is to side with the damned." But his spell over them was broken. They had followed him into the desert to dispense frontier justice, but they would not be the executioners of a woman in childbirth. They were hard men, but they were not monsters. His fanaticism, stripped bare of its pious justifications, was ugly and unsettling. They looked at him not as a leader, but as a madman. Inside the cave, the world had shrunk to the rhythm of my own body, a storm of pain and effort. Jeremiah was with me in the storm, his hands cool on my feverish skin, his presence an unshakable mountain. He was the only thing holding my world together. The agony was immense, a fire that consumed me, but with every wave I felt his strength flowing into me, saw the fierce determination in his eyes, and I knew I was not alone. The final confrontation was not mine to witness, but I heard it. My father, consumed by a rage so profound it had become a physical entity, let out a final guttural roar of frustration. He would do it himself. I heard the scuffle of boots on gravel as he charged the cave, a man intent on destroying the one thing he could not control. And then, as the greatest wave of pain crested and broke, as a final monumental effort tore from my soul, a new sound filled the valley. It was not a cry of pain or a shout of anger. It was the first piercing, magnificent wail of my child, the sound of life. It cut through the tension like a holy blade. It stopped everything. It stopped the charge. It stopped the hate. It was a sound so pure and powerful that it laid bare the petty, profane nature of my father's violence. The silence that followed was broken only by the baby's insistent cries and my own ragged sobs of relief and exhaustion. I heard a dull thud from the mouth of the cave. Jeremiah had met my father's charge. He had not used a weapon. He had used the cold, hard finality of the valley wall. My father lay on the ground, a broken, wheezing heap, his holy war ending not with a bang, but with a pathetic slump. Jeremiah emerged from the cave, his chest rising and falling, and stood over the man who had tried to destroy us. He looked at the remaining members of the posse, his eyes promising a swift end should they choose to continue this fight. But their fight was over. The weathered man who had first spoken out simply shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. Without a word, he turned and walked away. The others followed, their shoulders slumped in defeat and shame. They left my father where he lay, a fallen prophet, abandoned by his own disciples in the shadow of the life he had sought to extinguish. The past was finally truly over. Jeremiah returned to the cave. To me, he knelt down and looked at the tiny, squirming creature I held in my arms. Our child, a son. He reached out a tentative finger and gently touched the baby's cheek, and in the soft light of the cave, this fierce warrior, this grieving widower, this silent guardian smiled. It was a smile of such pure, unadulterated wonder that it healed the last of the broken places within me. We were safe. We were whole. We were a family. The weeks that followed the confrontation were a time of quiet healing. The violent echoes of my father's rage faded, replaced by the gentle, demanding rhythms of new life. The valley, once a place of survival and refuge, transformed into a home, its stone walls holding not just our bodies, but the warmth of our small, complete family. My father did not simply vanish. The morning after the birth, Jeremiah approached the broken man where he had huddled through the night, stripped of his pride and his followers. He did not offer him violence or vengeance. Instead, he offered him the same bitter mercy that had been shown to me. He placed a skin of water and a piece of cooked rabbit meat on the ground. "You judged your daughter weak and cast her into the wilderness," Jeremiah said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now it will be your judge. Walk. If your God is just, he will see you home. But never return to this place. This ground is sacred now." I watched from the mouth of the cave as my father, the great Reverend Rose, a pillar of his community, struggled to his feet. He did not look at me. He could not. He picked up the provisions and stumbled away, a hunched and pathetic figure quickly swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. I never saw him again, and I never mourned his loss. He had become a ghost to me long before the desert claimed him. Our days were filled with our son. He was a perfect fusion of our two worlds. With my fair hair, but with Jeremiah's dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything, he was a child of the valley, soothed to sleep by the trickle of the waterfall and the whisper of the wind through the rocks. One evening, as we sat by the fire, the baby asleep in a small cradle Jeremiah had woven from willow branches, I knew it was time. "He needs a name," I said softly. Jeremiah looked from the child to me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "In the tongue of my people," he said, "we would call him Nathan, for he is the gift of the mountain, or perhaps Daniel, for the strength that comes through trials." The names were beautiful, full of the strength and history of his people. But he was of my world, too. I thought of the stories I knew, not the fire and brimstone tales of my father, but the older ones of strength and steadfastness. "I would call him Samuel," I said, "not for the prophet who fell from grace, but for the first man to hear God's voice in the wilderness, for the red earth that makes up this land and this valley." Jeremiah considered this, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Samuel Nathan," he said, tasting the name. "A man of the new earth and a gift of the mountain. It is a good name. It is his name." We sat in a comfortable silence, watching our son sleep. His name a bridge between our two pasts, a foundation for his future. I thought then of my father's last cruel words to me, about having my mother's corruption in my blood. For the first time, I understood them not as a curse, but as a key. My mother, who had died when I was young, was a quiet, gentle woman in my memory. But perhaps she too had a love that defied the town's rigid rules. Perhaps her corruption was a fierce capacity for a love that others deemed a sin. I realized I had not repeated her failing. I had inherited her strength. "The silence in my heart was a sickness," Jeremiah said quietly, as if hearing my thoughts. "For a long time I thought the only cure was to forget. But this child, his cries do not erase the quiet. They build a new song within it. You have taught me that a heart can break and still grow strong enough to hold a new life. We had saved each other, not by erasing our scars, but by learning to see the beauty in them. Our love story was not written in flowery prose or whispered promises, but in shared hardship, in fierce protection, and in the profound, quiet moments of grace we had found in the wilderness. The next evening, we stood at the edge of the valley, watching the sunset, its fiery colors painting the clouds. Jeremiah held Samuel Nathan against his chest, the baby's small head resting over his heart. I leaned against him, my head on his shoulder, his arm wrapping around me. We were three outcasts, a warrior who had lost his tribe, a girl who had been abandoned by her town, and a child who belonged to both and neither. But standing there under the vast and holy mountain sky, we were not defined by what we had lost. We were defined by what we had built. We were a family, we were a nation of our own, and we were finally undeniably home.